then retreated back into his Führer bunker where he'd spent the last 3 months and where he'd now spend the last few days of his life. And very strange things would happen in that bunker.
Historians are stunned again as sailors uncover long-lost World War II bunkers, and the scene inside chills even the toughest researchers. During the 1930s and 1940s, powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan built hidden underground complexes to stash weapons, chemicals, and even hold prisoners.
There's music playing, there are orgies. He's wandering around and he's clearing up documents, clothes, medicines, bovine injections.
Now, modern crews have pried open one of those sealed rooms. What lay within is not just relics, but stories of fear, control, and survival. In this video, we step inside those buried spaces and face the raw human traces left beneath the surface today. Blockhaus d'Eperlec, France. The Blockhaus d'Eperlec was a giant bunker that German engineers began in 1943 to serve the new flying bombs and rockets. It was meant to hold fuel and machinery, to shelter a production plant for liquid oxygen, and to act as a base for launching V-rockets. The Allies hammered it with repeated raids, and it never reached the role the builders planned. When sailors and Allied troops moved through the area in September 1944, they found the complex abandoned and badly damaged by bombing. The huge concrete shell still showed signs of its purpose, a hulking frame for a machine that might have changed the war if it had been finished. Troops who secured the site had to work out what the giant rooms and buried channels were for, and later investigators confirmed that parts had been adapted to hold fuel and supplies instead of acting as a full launch plant. The scale of the place is what strikes you most. The Germans poured thick walls and roof slabs. They planned space for rail sidings and storage, and they expected to handle dozens of missiles and the cryogenic fuel those weapons needed. Tens of thousands of cubic meters of concrete went into the site. The workforce included thousands of forced laborers, French civilians, Soviet POWs, and concentration camp prisoners working under armed guard. Construction was brutal, and many workers died from exhaustion or accidents. Building it was brutal and fast, and the landscape around the bunker is still pocked with the scars of that effort. Allied air attacks were relentless. The campaign against the so-called V sites aimed to stop the rockets before they could be used. Heavy bombers and special precision weapons struck the complex. The damage made the original plan impossible, and German engineers then tried to reuse parts of the structure for other needs. By the time ground forces moved in, the Blockhaus had been neutralized as a launch base, but it still held clues, scrap, and the heavy geometry of a project that reached beyond its time. After the war, the bunker sat empty and slowly changed from threat to relic. Local people, researchers, and later museum makers took an interest. The site opened to visitors in the 1970s, and today it runs as a history park where the building itself tells most of the story. Walks around the Blockhaus show the scale, the bomb craters nearby, and the ways engineers tried to force modern weapons into a rural landscape. The site is protected as a historic monument and stands as one of the clearest physical links to the German effort to hit Britain with new weapons. The sailors, soldiers, and air crews who found and secured Eperleces did not uncover glory. They uncovered a work site of war, a hulking machine that had been stripped of its threat by persistence from the other side. The Blockhaus stands now as a place to learn, a concrete book that keeps a hard chapter of the 20th century readable for anyone who goes to listen. But 70 years later, another bunker would be opened, one that had been perfectly preserved since the day German soldiers walked out and never returned. The Sealed Command Post, Gironde, France. When archaeologists from Gramassa pried open a sealed hatch beneath Arcachon in May 2015, they found a German command bunker that time had left untouched. The entrance had been closed for 70 years, and everything inside remained exactly as it was in 1945. Beds in tidy rows, wiring still connected to sockets, a German warning sign still legible on the wall. It was built by German engineers in 1943 to guard the Arcachon Basin as part of the Atlantic Wall. The structure covers roughly 120 square meters, and it was designed to shelter a command team and to keep communications running even under bombardment. For decades, the building was buried and closed, then it was forgotten, even though older residents still knew where the hatch lay under the street. Opening the door felt like stepping into a working base. There were 9 beds set out in tidy rows. Wiring still ran to sockets and to a generator space. Switch boxes and telephone sockets stood in their compartments. A German warning sign remained near an entrance. It told people not to touch gear, and it treated any damage as sabotage. Those small things meant this bunker was not a random shelter. It was a local command point, a node in a bigger defensive web. The bunker was built under the city, and it was buried on purpose to hide it from direct fire and aerial attack. The walls and the ceiling were made to resist blasts rather than to stop a siege. They are about 2 meters thick in places, enough to give people and radios a chance to keep working while the world above was being struck. Inside, the rooms were laid out to support communication and planning. There was a main office area, sleeping bunks, storage niches, and a place for the generator that would have powered the lights and the telecoms. Because it was sealed so soon after the war, the interior felt calm and almost domestic. Beds with metal frames lay in orderly lines, shelves still held hooks and brackets where kits could hang, and the telephone loops sat ready to carry messages to other Arcachon positions. The sealed environment had preserved everything so completely that historians could see exactly how German soldiers had lived underground, beneath the feet of French civilians walking the streets above. The equipment was basic by modern standards, but it was everything that a small command team would have needed to keep control of the sector. The layout suggests it was meant for about 20 men, or the equivalent of 2 small fighting groups, enough to run a defended pocket and to relay orders. The discovery mattered for more than the gear. It was a true slice of daily war life, not a dramatic battle scene, but the steady, practical side of occupation. It showed how the Atlantic Wall was not only towers and big guns, it was also pipes of steel and wires of copper that kept people connected. It showed how soldiers lived under civilian streets, how a city could be layered over a military grid. Opening the hatch gave historians and the public a direct look at those layers. Today, local officials plan to open the bunker for guided tours, preserving it as both a classroom and a memorial. A buried reminder that war doesn't always announce itself with sirens and bombs. Sometimes it waits silently beneath your feet. The Nazi supergun launch bunker, Séricourt, France. Beneath that quiet stretch of a chalk hill in northern France, the Germans had carved a city of tunnels and chambers meant to launch a new kind of weapon at London. The place is called Mimoyex. What the builders planned there was not another rocket or bomber. It was a giant buried gun system known as the V3, a high-pressure cannon designed to fire dart-like shells over 100 miles. The guns were pointed on a bearing that lined up with central London, roughly 165 kilometers away. Work at Mimoyex began in late 1943. Engineers cut long tunnels under the hill and drove 5 deep shafts at an angle. Inside those shafts, they meant to stack rows of gun tubes. Each tube was part of a design called the Hochdruckpumpe, the high-pressure pump. Fuel charges would blast propellant into a projectile again and again down a long barrel, adding speed with each charge. In theory, this system could fire many shots very quickly, a steady rain of projectiles aimed at a single target. The plan was terrifying. Building the complex took huge effort and brutal labor. German firms and mining companies supplied engineers and machines. Prisoners of war and forced laborers dug and carried. They hewed chambers for storage, rooms for men, and a straight underground rail line to bring in shells and supplies. The main tunnel ran for hundreds of meters and fed into cross galleries where the gun barrels would sit. Shelters and offices were carved into the chalk at about 30 meters deep to keep men and ammo safe from bombing. The eastern complex pushed the furthest. The western site was hit by Allied bombs early on, and work stopped. At the eastern hill, drifts were cut to meet concrete plates on the surface. Those plates would hide narrow openings for the projectiles. Heavy steel covers were made to protect those openings. Tracks and an unloading platform ran along the main tunnel, and storage rooms lined the walls. The design showed a cold logic. Nothing was decorative. It was all purpose, made to move shells in, load the guns, fire, and keep working. Allied intelligence did not fully know what the V3 would be. Photographs and reports raised alarms. Some thought the site might launch V2 rockets. The danger was clear enough to make Mimoyex a major target. From late 1943, the Allies battered the area with bombs. The most decisive blow came in July 1944, when heavy tallboy bombs were used to collapse parts of the complex. Those huge, earth-penetrating bombs were designed to wreck tunnels and bring down shafts. Hundreds of forced laborers were still working in the tunnels when the tallboy bombs hit. The blasts collapsed entire galleries, burying workers alive. The Germans never recorded how many died. The planned battery of guns never fired at London from Mimoyex. After the war, the site lay quiet. For decades, the tunnels lay abandoned, stripped for scrap metal, the steel gun port covers sold to quarries as drill equipment. The scars in the chalk slowly disappeared under grass and brush. Local historians and researchers later pulled the story back into daylight. In the 1990s, interest rose again, and a program of study and conservation slowly took shape. Some of the surviving steel plates were returned and reinstalled at the site around 2010. The hill that nearly became a launching base for massed bombardment became a place of memory instead. Walking the tunnels now, the scale is clear. The slanted drifts, the concrete slabs above, the straight railbed, and the cross galleries tell the story of an industrial plan to make war by pressure and repetition. You do not see a single giant gun. You see the remains of a system, an architecture built to feed and fire. The technical problems of the V3 and the steady pressure of Allied bombing meant the project could not reach full power. Yet the concept was bold and dangerous enough that the Allies treated Mimoyex as a top priority. This site holds many stories. It is a story of modern engineering pushed into an older landscape. It is also a story of human cost, the forced laborers cut into the chalk and the workers buried by collapsing tunnels. It is a study in how technology and geography meet in war. Above all, Mimoyex shows how a plan that looked unstoppable on paper can be stopped by a different kind of force, by bombs, by intelligence, and by the Allies who made the hill one of their hardest targets. That tension between massive technical ambition and hard wartime reality is the heart of the site. Mimoyex is not just a ruin. It is an answer, in concrete and chalk, to the question of how ideas for mass violence were made and how they failed. Churchill's secret army hideout, Scotland, UK. An iron door peeked out from under roots and bracken in a southern Scottish wood. Forestry workers lifted sod and found a long, narrow concrete bunker buried low in the soil. The deepest end sits about 1.3 meters under the surface. The shelter measured about 23 feet by 10 feet. Brick walls and a thin roof kept it tight. Inside there were old wood scraps and a dented tin can, plain traces of life in a place built for hiding. This bunker was one of many used by Britain's auxiliary units. Formed in 1940, these units were local volunteers trained for guerrilla work if invasion came. Each unit was small, often 7 or 8 men. They learned ambush, sabotage, and demolition. They practiced moving without being seen and then disappearing into fields and woods. The bunkers were hidden bases where men could sleep, store weapons, and wait for orders. The auxiliary units were different from the Home Guard. These volunteers worked in secret and accepted cruel risks. Records and historians say some men were told that if capture seemed likely, they should kill themselves rather than be taken prisoner and forced to give information. That harsh rule made volunteering a grave choice. Each volunteer understood the mission. If Germany invaded, they would emerge from bunkers like this to sabotage supply lines and assassinate officers, then disappear back into the countryside. Capture meant torture and execution, or forcing themselves to take cyanide pills they carried for that purpose. Many of the recruits were ordinary farmers, tradesmen and laborers who took on an extraordinary duty. The bunker itself is spare and practical. Narrow sleeping platforms ran along one wall. Shelves and hooks held the kit. A small corner would have held a stove or field cooker. Little niches hid tools, maps, and demolition charges. Weapons were kept where they could be grabbed quickly. Revolvers and a submachine gun and perhaps a sniper rifle for units that had one. Every item had to be compact and useful. There was no space for comfort. Its low profile was its defense. Many similar bases were lost after the war when fields were plowed or hedges grew back. Some bunkers stayed known only to a few old hands who guarded the secret and then died. So when the forestry team pulled back leaves and iron and found the door, they closed one long chapter of mystery. Archaeologists surveyed the find with care. They recorded the layout and cataloged the objects. A scrap of wood that might have been a bed shows how cramped life could be. A single dented tin speaks to a quick meal eaten by lamplight. Those small things are powerful witnesses. They tell less about strategy and more about the daily weight of readiness. This small hole in the ground also maps the war onto ordinary life. Men who worked by day trained in secret by night. Neighbors who met at markets might have been part of a hidden network. The presence of the bunker turns a quiet stretch of woods into a place where citizens once prepared to do deadly work to protect others. Historians link these bunkers into a wider resistance plan, each one connected to other positions and to local guides who moved information through the area. The aim was not glory. It was to slow an enemy, to break supply lines, and to throw a spanner into invading plans. The men who manned these hidden bases had to live tight, spare lives, and then strike where it would matter most. Now the iron door stands open. Inside, a dented tin can and wooden bed scraps are all that remain of men who trained to become killers, then returned to their farms and shops and never spoke of it again. The Buried Trio, Vlissingen, Belgium. The work crew was clearing invasive plants from the dunes at Willemspark in 2024 when metal met shovel. Just inches under the sand, they hit concrete, and a short while later they exposed not one, but 3 intact German bunkers. The discovery came during a dune restoration project run by the Agency for Nature and Forests. The finds were buried so shallow that the bunkers had simply been covered over and forgotten, rather than smashed into pieces like lighter wartime builds. These were not tiny hideouts. These were standard German group shelters, each built to house about 10 soldiers, small units stationed near radar posts to watch for Allied landings. That classification matters because the VF-2A was built to house a Gruppe, the smallest German infantry unit of about 10 men, often placed near forward radar or observation posts. The type turned up across the Atlantic Wall, in dunes and along coasts where quick, tough protection and communications were needed. The numbers tell you why the shells survived. Each bunker measures roughly 6 by 7 meters on the outside. Their roofs and walls were poured as thick concrete, around a meter or so in depth in many accounts, thick enough to stand up to blasts and to hold the sand above them for decades. Because heavy concrete stayed in place where lighter structures were reused as rubble, these VF-2A shelters lay effectively frozen under the dunes until the restoration team opened them. Inside the chambers, the team found the ordinary instruments of war, the small items that say more about day-to-day life than big guns do. Archaeologists uncovered 2 brick trenches, a piece of a concrete track used to move supplies, a water well, and a lot of rubble filled with everyday things. The rubble held the traces of daily life, a dented mess tin, sections of communications cable, water pipes that once supplied the garrison, and ammunition fragments scattered in the dirt. For the soldiers stationed here, life meant long watches staring at empty seas, sleeping in cramped quarters, and waiting for an Allied invasion that would come from a direction they weren't watching. Those objects give the site a human scale. They show how soldiers lived and worked there, how they moved stores and kept lines of communication alive. Finding 3 intact bunkers in a small park is a clear reminder that the Atlantic Wall was not one continuous line of massive turrets. It was a web of many small parts, a network of shelters, tunnels, tracks, and posts. The coastal zone around Blockhaus once held more than 60 German structures, and the bunkers at Wilhelmspark were part of that local stronghold. Uncovering these VF2A shelters helps fill a local map of how the defenses were organized and where troops kept watch. The condition of the finds makes the site valuable to researchers. When heavy concrete stays put, it can protect interior fittings and the traces that tell a plain story. These bunkers had been spared the common post-war habit of taking lighter brick buildings apart for building material. Instead of being cannibalized, they were buried, which kept evidence like brickwork patterns, floor levels, and small fittings intact. That means archaeologists can study layout, construction sequence, and the items left behind, and draw firmer conclusions about how the positions were used. There is also a local angle. Wilhelmspark sits where people walk and children play. For decades, the bunkers were hidden under a living dune that changed with wind and weather. Older residents remembered hints of wartime works below their feet, but the details were lost to vegetation and shifting sand. The restorers' careful approach made it possible to recover the structures without destroying the surrounding habitat. That balance between nature work and heritage recovery matters when a community chooses how to handle finds like this. The Mountain Lair, Project Risa, Poland. Risa was not a single bunker. It was a plan so large it swallowed whole hills. From 1943 to 1945, the Nazis set prisoners to hew tunnels and chambers inside the Owl Mountains. The goal was secrecy, shelter, and space enough for staffs to live and run a government if the fighting reached them. The tunnels were meant to be more than hiding places. Commanders wanted safe rooms for communications, offices, storage, and workspaces for ministries and armed services. Top leaders could move into an underground network and keep running the war under heavy air attack. To build that network, the regime used a web of camps and forced labor. Prisoners from the Gross-Rosen concentration camp system, many Jewish along with Polish resistance fighters and Soviet POWs, were forced to dig these tunnels under SS guard. They worked in brutal conditions with minimal food and rest. SS officer Albert Lutkemeyer ran the camps with strict discipline. Disease, exhaustion, and rockfalls killed many. Some simply vanished into the work, their deaths unrecorded. Tracks and rails, bits of cable, worn picks, and rusted shovels were left where crews had dropped them. The mountain keeps these tools as quiet witnesses. The Owl Mountains were chosen for clear reasons. The ridges are inland, shielded from early bombing. Dense forest gave cover. The stone, while hard, makes strong vaults when lined correctly. That mix of geology and distance to the front made the site fit for a headquarters meant to survive the worst. Technical work was complex. Tunnels needed power, air, and light. Vent shafts brought fresh air. Pumps handled water. Rooms were wired for phones and radio. Concrete was poured into forms to make reinforced galleries. The effort needed skilled technicians, cranes, trucks, and a long supply chain that used the same roads as the Army. The plan assumed that once built, the underground station would operate like a living center. After the war, many entries were sealed, equipment removed, and parts of the site were left to settle. Nature reclaimed roads and campsites. Some tunnels collapsed under their own weight. Later, explorers and researchers returned. They mapped galleries, recorded supports, and dated layers of work. They found remains of barracks, ration tins, bunk frames, and marks of hasty construction. Archaeology turned the mountain into a book, reading scars of labor and lines of concrete. What Risa was truly for remains disputed. Some chambers have ventilation systems and electrical installations that exceed what a command center would need. Were sections intended for weapons research or manufacturing? The incomplete construction, destroyed German records, and sealed Soviet exploration leave these questions unanswered. The underground chemical factory, Falkenhagen, Germany. What sits at Falkenhagen is a 4-level concrete maze that German engineers started before the war and kept expanding during it, The whole complex covers roughly 14,000 square meters. It was meant to make a chemical called N-Stoff, chlorine trifluoride, a substance that eats through metal, burns things that normally do not burn, and poisons the air. It ignites glass, concrete, and sand on contact. It reacts explosively with water. Spills couldn't be extinguished. They had to burn themselves out while eating through whatever they touched. The plant was part laboratory, part factory, and part bunker all at once. The plan for Falkenhagen was huge and coldly practical. Planners talked about producing tens of tons of the stuff every month and also putting in facilities for other deadly agents. Sections were built under earth and reinforced with concrete so that the dangerous work could continue even if the skies were full of bombs. The rooms, the service tunnels, the storage vaults, the railway tracks that linked spaces all show that the project was meant to run at an industrial scale. But the machine never reached its full speed. Completion plans and wartime chaos meant production stayed small compared with the hopes on paper. When the Red Army moved west in 1945, the site did not stay empty for long. Soviet forces took over and did not simply abandon the hallways and tanks. They used the place, closed it up, and kept many of its special features. Over the next 2 decades, the complex changed again from a secret factory into a military hub for the Soviets and for the Warsaw Pact. By the 1960s, the site was turned into a major command and control center outside the Soviet Union. It served as a place where communications, planning, and numbers were gathered and controlled. The bunker was not only machines and pipes. It gained living quarters, a hospital, shops, transport links, and places for the people who ran the base to live and to be looked after. That later life left its own marks. People who worked at Falkenhagen in the Cold War years added rooms, wired up new technology, fitted power systems, and created amenities you would not expect under a bunker. There were theaters for show evenings, a sauna to wash off the grime, and stores to buy everyday goods. The site became, for a time, a buried small town. Western intelligence files once flagged Falkenhagen as one of the Warsaw Pact's main fortified nodes in Central Europe. For planners on both sides, the complex was important because it combined protection with the ability to keep command links alive even under attack. After German reunification, the site returned to civilian hands and the Russians left. When German authorities and historians first entered the complex in the early 1990s, they found the Soviets had stripped most equipment, but the massive concrete structure remained. 4 levels of tunnels, blast doors weighing tons, and chemical storage tanks too large to remove. They stripped much of the interior equipment. Wiring, instruments, and anything of practical military value was removed. What remained was a skeleton of reinforced concrete, the tunnels and halls, and some heavy doors and tanks that were too big to shift easily. Visitors and researchers who stepped inside in later years described the feeling of vast, empty rooms, the echo of concrete, and a few surviving bits that hinted at the place's layered past. Even after stripping, intact blast doors and immense diesel tanks could still be found spanning several floors. This bunker is not just a curious ruin. It is a clear record of choices taken across decades. It shows how a regime prepared in secret for new ways to hurt people. It shows how an occupying army reused the space for its own needs. It shows how military planners in the Cold War set up hardened nodes far from Moscow to keep a chain of command working. And it shows how the visible work of building, wiring, and fitting out spaces sits on top of darker work, the manufacture and testing of chemicals designed to burn or to poison. If you think about the human side of it, the place was built by hands, men and women who set concrete, who ran pipes, who serviced machines. Some of those people may have believed in the work. Some answered orders. Others did the job because that was the town and the job available. Later, those same spaces housed different people with different work, yet the underground bones stayed the same. History is often told in dates and maps. Falkenhagen records a different kind of history. It records labor, secrecy, fear, and the tired routines that keep a large operation running underground for decades. The site is a heavy lesson and an awkward relic. It has concrete and rust and hollow corridors, and behind those walls are the traces of chemistry meant for war, and the layers added by later empires. That combination makes Falkenhagen more than a bunker. It is a long, quiet document of how war changes places, and then how those places are changed again as the lines on maps shift.